Melinda has a background. She started writing some articles which you may have read in the UFO Encounter that's come out to you. She's written a couple of articles for that. She's a researcher. She's got a Bachelor of Science with honours, and her interests include planetary colonisation, alien hybridisation, human ancestry and archaeology. So Melinda's going to talk to you tonight about alien life on Mars, science versus ufology. So she'll be looking at the scientific approach to life, the idea of life on Mars, and opposed to the UFO perspective, and some other alternative sources of information too. So this is Melinda's first public presentation with our group, so would you please make her warmly welcome.
Thank you. I just hope this technology agrees with me tonight. Okay. Yeah, as Cheryl said, tonight's talk about alien life on Mars will be a review of both scientific knowledge and alternative information that is offered through the field of ufology. So first off, I just thought I'd share a little bit of background about me. I'm a final year PhD student in the field of environmental geochemistry. I look at the weathering of rocks, especially how the salts are released. I do a lot of work on the microscope and in the laboratory. I'm also interested in planetary science as well as archaeology, and I've read quite a bit about the ancient astronaut theory. I've come to the conclusion that humans didn't evolve naturally on planet Earth. Don't know if you agree with that, but I see a few nods out there, yep. My personal experience is that the UFO phenomena is real, but it is also elusive. I think that evolution is a spiritual experience that we don't yet fully understand. Like many people, I believe that we are guided by a higher intelligence that wants us to become aware of our place in the greater universe. So in short, we're not alone. The problem I'm often confronted with in my research is that mainstream science is stuck in a paradigm where intelligent life does not exist outside planet Earth. So as a result, any evidence supporting the contrary is regarded as anomalous. What I mean by this is that science will not take the subject of UFOs seriously. It's like they've been trying to fit a circle into a square box. Whenever the evidence of extraterrestrial life arises, it's always ignored or debunked, even if it results in ridiculous, nonsensical arguments. And you have to ask yourself, why are scientists doing this? They're supposed to be the smart ones. Anomalies should always be investigated, because that's how discoveries are made. So before I begin in proper, I'm just going to outline some of the topics I'll be talking about tonight. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the landings that NASA has made on Mars. I'll talk about the changing perception regarding the possibility of water on Mars and also plate tectonics. We'll discuss how Earth-like Mars was in the past and when things might have changed. I'll look at the surface features and possible underground habitats for life that are either being overlooked or avoided in the exploration of Mars. We'll take a bit of a break and then we'll come back and discuss some interesting discoveries about a possible radioactive signature on Mars for an atomic weapon detonation. That'll be interesting. We'll go over some notes from remote viewing that describe the pyramids as a shelter from dust storms. And next, after that, we'll read an account from alien abductee Ali Newworld. He's from New Zealand like myself, if you haven't detected the accent yet. And finally, we'll look at the possibility of a cover-up of alien life on Mars. That's just for you, Lee. We'll put it all together and try and work out what it all means. And just before we begin, if there's any non-scientists among you, which I'm sure there are plenty. The first half of the talk will be pretty sciencey, so if you find it boring, bear with me, because we'll get to the more ufology, UFO kind of stuff in the second half. So I just want to put it all into perspective for you. So we're going to start with the early NASA missions to Mars. Now this is a map of landing locations of the spacecraft that they've put on Mars. Now the names in yellow are the past landing sites. So they're the ones that the historical missions. And the ones in white are the ones that they're planning to do in the future. So at first glance they seem pretty spread out. Generally they try to land the spacecraft in the bottom of a crater where the surface is nice and flat. The main one that was a bit different was Phoenix, right at the top. I'll point to here, it's right up there. And they put it up there because they wanted to study the polar ice cap and see, have a look at that water that's actually frozen. Now the first types of landers were not designed to move about on the surface. These ones here, Viking. The Viking missions in 1975 and 1976, they just landed and they stuck out a sampling chute to collect whatever soil was sitting on. You can see that black thing, that's the chute where they collect the soil. Now, Pathfinder in 1997 was the first base station to land that contained a mobile rover. So it's Pathfinder over there, that's the base station. The rover Sojourner collected and analysed rocks by moving around on the surface, and if you look over here, this is just a comparison of the different rovers. So Sojourner, that's the first one, it only travelled 0.1 miles, which is about 160 metres, so not very far. Opportunity rover is the top one. That's covered the most ground because it has been operating for the longest time continuously. Curiosity rover, that's only been going for 4 years, so it's still working its way up to Opportunity's set there of the target. Spirit and Opportunity were identical rovers that landed in different locations within a few months of each other back in 2004. Unfortunately, the Spirit rover got stuck in some soft sand in 2010 and it just never really recovered. They couldn't get it out. The Opportunity rover was a bit luckier, but you might have heard in the news recently there was a big dust storm on Mars. Did anybody catch that? I've actually got a picture of the news article. Okay, so this was in the National Geographic. There was a big dust storm in June 2018 and the storm was so large it covered 1/4 of the planet. The particles in the air blotted out all the sunlight, which meant that the solar panels on the top of the rover, those are them there, those are solar panels, that's how it gets all its energy. They wouldn't work anymore, so it just had to shut down. Now, Curiosity, which was the newest one, which landed just in 2012, it wasn't near the dust storm because it didn't cover the whole planet, just about 1/4 of it. It landed in a different place. And they were also planning to send one more rover, at least one more, in 2020. So that's going to cost the US $2.5 billion. So that's a lot of money they're spending just to look at a few rocks. Yeah, so it seems that back in the early days, NASA was really keen to prove that there was no life on Mars at all. Nothing. That's what they want to say. Dead planet. Now, if we look at the picture on the left, this one over here, we see a cross-section of what scientists think Mars looks like just below the surface. We have a thin layer of iron-rich reddish-coloured dust on the top, so just here on top of everything. But beneath this layer there's a lot more moisture, possibly even pools of water. We're going to go into a bit of detail and talk about that later. For now, we're just going to have a look at this dust layer that's coating everything. Now, Martian dust is extremely fine and light. It gets blown about in the Martian storms until it eventually settles down onto everything. Now it coats the rocks. It forms, as you can see up here, on top of all the rocks there's this really hard kind of crusty layer on top of everything, and initially they didn't know how to break through this, so they couldn't actually see what was under the surface. And then if you look down at this photo here, this is actually taken by one of the rovers, and they've actually equipped a drill so that they can get through this Martian dust layer and actually sample this rock that's underneath. You're probably wondering, well, how is that important? I'll show you. Okay. Now, because the atmosphere of Mars is so thin, the top layer is practically sterilised from radiation. We've got no protection from the solar wind coming through. It's like the entire surface has been sprayed with a pesticide. It's almost impossible for life to survive on the surface of Mars. Now, however, we do have frozen lakes that are thought to exist deep underground, and if there's anything living on Mars, it's going to be below the surface. Now, before the rovers, what we knew about Martian rocks came from meteorites that had fallen to Earth. And you can see a couple of examples here on the left. So we've got Black Beauty. It's a very, very old one, and there's a more recent one. That's only 1.1 million years old, and that one's 4.4, so quite a wide range of rocks there. In particular, in 1996, there was one meteorite that caused quite a stir, and it was called the Allen Hills 84001. And now when they put this meteorite under the microscope, they saw what they thought were microorganisms. And President Bill Clinton even went on and did a public official statement to say, we've found life on Mars. And guess what happened after that? They rubbished it, that's right, yep. So they withdrew the announcement claiming that the objects were too small to contain DNA, and then they also said, just to make sure that nobody believed it, the rock had been contaminated by a local biofilm. That's what they said. So at that point, they were still very cautious about saying that life could exist on Mars. So this is 1996. Now, 20 years later, the debate is still ongoing. There's scientists out there that say, no, these are definitely microorganisms. And there's some kind of cover-up going on. They don't say that publicly, though. So we're going to talk about water. One of the key questions about Mars is whether or not it contains water. But why is water so important to finding life on Mars? First, we have to know what are the key ingredients for life to form on a planet, according to mainstream science. We need a liquid medium, such as water, for life to do its chemical reactions in. Now, if you don't have water, it's like trying to cook without oil. You need a transport medium for the molecules to react. So, in a nutshell, this is what scientists think that we need in order to have life on another planet. So we need a temperature where water can exist in liquid form. We need an energy source which provides enough light for photosynthesis to occur. For the non-scientists, that just means so that plants can grow. Yeah. We need an atmosphere and a magnetic field to protect the planet from all the solar wind and radiation that is out there in the universe. So we need protection, and we also need nitrogen and oxygen as the building blocks of life to make DNA. Well, on Mars, we can see that there are polar ice caps. Couldn't these ice caps just be melted down to create liquid water? Well, no. Unfortunately, because of the low pressure and thin atmosphere, liquid water on Mars just boils away, just evaporates. Hang on, I'll go back. However, it can exist in solid form as ice. There is a lot of frozen ice sitting just below the surface. So we can see this is a picture from a rover, and it's just scraped away the dirt, and you can see that's actually frozen water just sitting under the surface. The temperature ranged from about -20 to minus 100 degrees for the Phoenix spacecraft. This is this one here, when it landed near the top of the North Pole. So what happened, what it noticed was at about minus 65 degrees, it actually started snowing on Mars. So yes, believe it or not, that happens on Mars. So the question then is frozen water enough to sustain life, or does it have to be liquid? So there you go. That's why there's so much hype about liquid water. That's why we need it. If we don't have it, no life. That's what they're saying. And guess what? In 2015, liquid water was found on Mars. I hope that makes you excited. The next thing I'm going to show you came out just yesterday. So this is fairly recent stuff. They're saying they found a liquid body of water on Mars. Now this was a 20-kilometre salt lake reservoir about 1.5 kilometres under the surface, just near the southern pole. So it's under the ice cap. Now the salt in the water lowers its freezing point, so it's still in liquid form. Now, is it possible for organisms to survive in salty water? What do you think? No, of course it is. I don't know how they're having any kind of doubt about this. Oh. Okay, so they've admitted it. They've admitted there's liquid water on Mars. And some scientists are even saying now there's no way there could not be life on Mars. Okay, so what they're saying now is that Mars was once quite Earth-like in the distant past. So they want to make that distinction that it was long ago. It's not now. Now it's just a dead planet. So if there was ancient life on Mars, it probably died out millions of years ago. Yeah, probably. Now here's where we're going to start delving a bit more into the heavy science stuff. So what we're going to look at is one of the other key components of life that we looked at was it needs an atmosphere and a magnetic field. Now believe it or not, in order to have those things, you need to have what is called an active planet. So what's an active planet? An active planet is one that has plate tectonics. Now on Earth we know that the continents all kind of fit together like a kind of a jigsaw. They're all broken up pieces of what we call continental crust. Now when these pieces of crust they rub against each other, we get earthquakes. They can move in all sorts of different directions. They can push up to form mountains, and there's usually volcanoes along the boundaries. Now, as far back as 1997, scientists had clues that plate tectonic activity had occurred on Mars. Now, they knew this from the Sojourner rover. What the Sojourner did, it only travelled, remember, 160 metres. It didn't go very far, but it found a couple of rocks. So the first one it found, this one here, Barnacle Bill Martian rock. And when they had an onboard analyzer on the Sojourner, it was called the, I've got the name here, Alpha Proton X-ray Spectrometer. That's the name here, APXX. SX, that's what it stands for. So this is the spectra that they saw from the onboard instruments, and the main thing that they noticed was this, see this peak here, this is SI, it stands for silicon, and this was a lot higher than the background level compared to a lot of the other rocks in the area. And what they found was that this means that it came from deep within a volcano. Now the other rock they found, over here, this is Yogi. They gave them all really great names, didn't they? I think there was another one, Scooby-Doo. Anyway, okay, so then this one over here, Yogi, it had a different composition, but it was also very interesting because it was another volcanic rock, but it came from not deep within the volcano, but just from a lava flow. So even though we had these volcanic rocks, scientists weren't convinced that Mars had plate tectonics. They're still saying, no, it's dead, nothing going on there. Now, just in 2012, they found what could be a fault. So this is a strike-slip fault. So if you just look at this diagram here, this is what it looks like. So you've just got two plates next to each other, and there's a little bit of an offset here, and this is what is happening in this picture. It's 150 kilometres of offset. That's a pretty big offset. Now, they noticed this from space, okay? They were just looking at pictures from space. The trough itself is absolutely massive. You can see it even in all the Mars pictures. It's called the Valles Marineris Basin. And if you look at the topographical picture here, the red is the high ground and the blue is the low ground. Now, this is actually 4 kilometres deep, so it's about 4 times as deep as the Grand Canyon. Yeah, it's huge. Now, not everyone is convinced this is a fault line. There's been some alternative explanations that I thought we'd go into just to see, have a look. I know you guys are into this stuff. Okay, so some well-qualified electrical engineers came up with an alternative explanation that this big trench had been carved out by an electrical discharge. And they've replicated it on a small scale here. Now this is pretty small, and they're just comparing it to this here. This is, see how it's got all these little branching sort of fingers? They're saying that that's what these here are. Now, they've done it on a small scale, but could this happen on a planetary scale? Is such a thing even possible? Now, if we look at Hindu mythology, this is the ancient astronaut theory coming in. According to the mythology, such a weapon did exist, and it was called the Vajra, and it was made by the gods. It is said that when it was hurled at an opponent, this is the Vajra down here, this is just what they think it looked like. It blazed like a meteoric fire across the heavens. It was used to destroy a giant. That's the giant there lying down who's been vanquished. So did our ancestors just make these stories up? You might think probably, but then there was some science that might possibly confirm some of this stuff happening. But there's scientific evidence to prove that. They're saying, not without a doubt, nuclear weapon signature. Okay. So Dr. Brandenburg is suggesting this happened about 500 million years ago, and we weren't around then. There was no humans. Who was making these nuclear bombs? Was there a cosmic weapon that carved out that trench that we looked at? I mean, maybe this stuff isn't quite as far-fetched as we think, if there's scientific evidence to prove it. So we're going to come back to some of that later. Yeah, so that's what he saw, elevated levels of xenon-29. Yeah, and all this glassy rocks. Yeah, you can't debate that kind of evidence. It's the nuts and bolts that some people are like, yeah, okay. All right, so we're going to have a look at some of the similarities between Mars and Earth. So this is a topographical map of Mars. Now the highest points of the planet are red, and there are a lot of volcanoes in this area. So that's this area here, so very, very high elevation. The yellow and orange sections, they're kind of a mid-level. They're full of very old cratered rocks. So if you look, they're all around this bottom half of the planet. And then if we go up to the top, you'll notice it's very smooth and low-lying and uncratered. It's quite strange. Now keep in mind that Mars is a much smaller planet than Earth, and they both, according to science, are formed at the same time, 4.6 billion years ago. So Mars, because of its small size, would have cooled a lot sooner, and life potentially could have started earlier. Now, I want you to look at that topography again. Now, there's something really wrong with it. Can anybody compare that to Earth? What does Earth look like? You've got these kind of land masses separated by oceans, right? Well, this is basically, we've got the bottom half is all land except for this big hole here, and the top half is like a big ocean. Yeah. Now, Scientists refer to this strange topography as the Martian dichotomy, and believe it or not, they can't explain it. They don't know how it got like that. Because they didn't think that Mars had any plate tectonics. They thought it was as dead. So they had to try and explain this, what we're seeing here. They said, oh, it has to be asteroids. An asteroid hit it and just wiped all the land off the top half. Seriously, this is what the theories that they're putting forward. That's crazy. But if you think about it, if you smash one object into another, you don't get a nice round circle at the end. So, what I'm saying is that the top half is an ocean and the bottom half is continental crust. And so we're just looking at two different types of land here. Okay, I'm up to. Yeah, this is just summarising all that I've been saying. If you look here, this is the bottom half, it's all cratered and very rough, and this is the top half that's quite smooth, except for this big trench right here that we're debating about how that formed. But yeah, this was the impact of two objects. Yeah, you can just imagine there's going to be a big dent or a huge explosion. But yeah, this is what I think: land down the bottom, ocean up the top. If you want to explain this, I think you have to accept that other planets are not going to behave exactly like Earth. Now, Mars is much smaller and has only 1/3 of the gravity. Yeah. On Earth, what we see is in the middle of the ocean are these mid-oceanic ridges. And what happens is as these oceanic crust spreads out, it gets subducted underneath. Here's a picture. It gets subducted underneath, and that's where we see the mountains and volcanoes forming. And so we get kind of this recycling effect. But on Mars, we don't see any of these ridges, and so that was one of the reasons why scientists were very keen to say, no, that's not an ocean. We're going to talk about the volcanoes. The low gravity on Mars really affects the size of the volcanoes. If you look up here, this is a Martian volcano. This is Olympus Mons in profile. You can see that it's very shallow. Compared to, this is an Earth volcano, this one here, I've just used as a comparison. So this is 2.3 kilometres tall. This is Olympus Mons, 27 kilometres tall. And you're probably wondering, why are the volcanoes on Mars so much bigger? And it's to do with the gravity. There's a lot less pressure stopping the magma from flowing upwards and out. Now, when the volcanoes do erupt, they get a big blockage, and when they do explode, it's just huge, and it's going to be a catastrophic event that affects the whole planet. It's going to cover all the atmosphere, possibly blocking out the sun. So there are going to be different mechanisms operating on Mars. Now, just to see who's awake, I'm going to throw in something to wake you up. I know we love this. What would aliens look like if they were on Mars with a lower gravity? So the theory is, if we were to go and live on Mars, we would become taller and thinner. Wouldn't that be lovely? So people that have spent a long time in space actually grow 1 or 2 inches in height. And it's a proven fact that lower gravity does make you taller. Okay, so what I was talking about before, the two massive plates that were stuck together, scientists used to think that was just one big homogeneous mass. But now, this is just recent, 2015, they've actually found evidence of the continental crust. That's that land that gets, that's the lighter material, and the oceanic crust goes underneath. So they've actually found that now. They can't, oh, there we go. They can't say that there's no plate tectonics on Mars. So Mars is small. They're saying it's too small to remain habitable because it cooled down and it couldn't maintain its plate tectonics. It's no longer an active planet. That's what they thought. But what if this assumption is wrong? And what if there is another reason why Mars lost its atmosphere? I just want you to hang on to that thought, because we're going to try and fit all these pieces together. I'm just showing you bits and pieces, and it's all going to come together, I hope, and it'll all make lots of sense. But first we're going to have a look at more volcanoes and some caves. Now there are 3 volcanoes on Mars, and this region is called the Tharsis region. It was that reddish area on the map that I showed you. And what we see is these 3 volcanoes all in a row. Now remember that scale. This is Olympus Mons, 27 kilometres high. Now until 2012, scientists didn't think that Mars had any plate tectonics, so they couldn't explain these volcanoes, why they were in a row. But we do see this kind of thing on Earth. There's chains of volcanoes. What happens is there's a hot spot in the magma coming up, and as the plate moves across, the hot spot stays in the same place, and the volcano, actually a new volcano, forms as the plate moves. Now, one of the unexplained phenomena on Mars is a subject that scientists don't really want to talk about. They don't want to bring it up because they found a number of these caves, and they were on the flanks of the volcanoes. If you think about it, if you were a humanoid species living on a very cold planet, where would you go for warmth and protection? You would go underground. Plus, if you're in a cave near a magma flow, it's going to provide heat and thermal energy. And if you just look here, here are these 3 volcanoes I just showed you, and they're very close to the equator, so it's going to be nice and warm. If there's anywhere to go that's warm, it's going to be there. Now, if you have a look at these pictures, you can't see a scale here, but this is actually 150 metres across. They're quite large, some of them even up to 250 metres. Now, it's interesting to see how circular they are, but they're so dark that the base of the cave cannot be seen. Now, the caves were spotted by an orbiting spacecraft using thermal imaging, and they showed that they were cooler than the surrounding area during the day and warmer than the surrounding area at night. So if you want to stay warm on a cold planet, that's where you go, into a cave. So it can get up to 20 degrees at the equator on Mars. Now I want to just do a quick comparison with an underground city called Derinkiyu. I'm sure Lee's heard of it. It's in Turkey. Now this city goes 60 metres underground, and it was thought to have housed about 20,000 people. It had huge ventilation shafts to let fresh air come down, and each floor could be closed off separately. Now it had rooms for livestock and features such as cellars and churches. Now people could have lived down in this place for a number of years, but why? Why would you want to live underground? And according to mythology, which gives us some clues, these ancient people built this city because they wanted to escape an ice age. They wanted to stay warm. Which brings us back to our caves. If you look at these pictures, this is the Martian cave. Does this look natural to you? Here's what they're saying it is. This is a lava tube on Earth. And you'll notice it's got very rough and jagged edges, and it's sort of a window, and you can see the lava flow underneath. And that's what they're saying. They're saying that these 2 things are the same, but there's obviously no lava flow underneath that one. But you can see that this cave here just goes directly downwards. This is what the lava tubes look like on Earth. This is what they're saying it is. The difference is that on Earth, the lava tubes run laterally. They don't go straight down, they're not vertical, and you get that window. But this is not what the caves on Mars look like. They're clearly something else, something artificial, maybe an entrance. And there's a size discrepancy as well. This lava tube up here, well, there's a person there for scale, so you can see that's only maybe well, if a person's even 2 metres tall, that's only like 4 metres, isn't it? So these things are quite small, and that cave we saw was up to 250 metres. Now they're saying that it's a bigger volcano, so bigger lava tubes. That's all they got. Right, we're going to talk about the dying surface. I mentioned before how the surface was kind of just completely sterilised. Is it dead? Scientists are keen to have plate tectonics end on Mars as far back in time as possible. The earlier the better, really. So they try to say that there was a meteorite bombardment 3.9 million years ago, and they round that up to 4 because they want it pushed back in time. They don't want Mars to be active. The problem is, the longer that Mars remains Earth-like, the higher the probability that life actually existed there, and that doesn't make them very comfortable. Now, when you think about it, some of those lava flows I showed you with those volcanoes, they're only 20 million years ago. That's not 4 billion. That's only, that's geologically recent. So, is it possible that something else has wiped out the atmosphere on Mars? Okay, so there are 4 basic reasons why plate tectonics are so crucial for life to have evolved on Mars, and plate tectonics is behind all of them. So the first is that we need rocks to be recycled to provide basic nutrients for microorganisms. We know that fresh, rich volcanic soil is the most productive. We know that from growing our veggies. But older soil, like the deserts of Australia, doesn't have many nutrients left in it. So there's been many experiments to prove this. And you can see right down the bottom here, nutrients in the soil. So that's what plate tectonics gives us. And that's the start of this whole big food chain before you even get to plants and animals. It's very, very basic. The second reason that we need plate tectonics is to bring water to the surface. Now, most people don't know this, but where do we actually get water from? We know it's recycled around. It goes up into the clouds and rains down. But where does it come from in the first place? Now, water actually originates from magma as a dissolved gas. When the planet is forming as just a ball of vapour and what else we got? Spinning dust and gas that all forms 4.6 billion years ago when the planet was forming. That actually traps water in the middle of the planet, and then it comes out when the volcanoes erupt. That's what you can sort of see in this picture here. So this is all the gases coming out, and they eventually form water. Now the third reason, and they talked about this in the video, is that plate tectonics provides a global temperature gauge. So I'll just explain this a little bit. So when it's too hot, we need to cool the planet down, and we do this by weathering rocks with the water that comes down here, and the rocks slowly dissolve, and then they get buried, and the different minerals that form, such as calcite, they actually take things like all the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and help to cool the planet down. And when it gets too cold, the volcanoes help us out by pumping these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So it's this big cycle. This is called the carbon cycle that helps to stabilise the planetary temperature and prevent any kind of fluctuations. So it gets pretty cold at the poles, but compared to Mars, Earth doesn't have as great a temperature fluctuations. Now the fourth reason that plate tectonics is important is because it produces a magnetic field that protects the planet from solar winds. Earth has a strong magnetic field. You can see that up here. And that's because we've got all this magma in the core that's churning, and that creates this magnetic field up here. Creates convection currents. Now, it is thought that early Mars, billions of years ago, did have a magnetic field. You can see that here. So this is Mars. But now, this is what we see. Not much at all. No magnetic field. And do you know what that means? It means it can't hold on to the atmosphere. It just gets stripped away by the solar wind. And they can actually, take measurements of the remnants of the magnetic field that used to exist on Mars. So they know it was there once. So to summarise, Mars would have had abundant life in the past, in the distant past, billions of years ago, but scientists say that due to its small size, the planet cooled and plate tectonics dwindled. The planet cannot hold an atmosphere due to the solar winds, which expose the planet to radiation and temperature fluctuations. If any life still survives, it is likely sought refuge beneath the surface where it is well protected. Radiation and dust. That's all we're left with. If you strip away that atmosphere and there's no protection for anything on the surface, we just get radiation and dust. Now, I want you to just switch off for a second. Put yourself in someone else's shoes. You're going to be an extraterrestrial on Mars with no atmosphere. It's been stripped off and your planet is dying. It's cooling down. Now, this is what this guy here, his name's Joe Moneagle. Sure knows the pronunciation, that's great. So in 1984, he did this remote viewing on Mars, putting himself back 1 million years in time. So here's what he saw. He described seeing enormous dust storms, pyramid forms, aqueducts and underground shelters. He said that it was the after effect of a major geological problem, which could have been dwindling plate tectonics. That's possible. He saw people who were very tall and thin. Do you remember our picture of the humanoid Martian? He was very tall and thin. But what this guy saw was that they were only a shadow, that they were hardly even there anymore. They were dressed in fitted light clothing like silk. He saw a very large structure, but it had no intricacies. It was possibly something like Derinkiyu, the underground city. It was huge like a rabbit warren. That's what he said. That's the cities that he saw, all underground. The ceiling was very high and the walls were very wide. Now, in the pyramids he saw chambers. They were stripped of any kind of furnishings. They were just for hibernations. He said they were trying to sleep through the storms. Remember how we had those big dust storms covering 1/4 of the planet? So they have to find a way to survive these storms. And these people are dying. So 1 million years ago there was some kind of life on Mars, but it was really struggling to survive. They're hanging on to look or wait for something to return or to come back with an answer. Now, the party of ETs left to find a new place to live. Where do you think you would go if you were on Mars looking for somewhere else to live? Yeah. Okay, so their atmosphere was, their environment was corrupted and it was failing very rapidly. So they had to find somewhere else to live. And what this guy saw was that there was environmental disturbance. He saw a planet that went through a comet's tail. So it was all very cosmic. Now he saw something there that nobody's ever mentioned in science. So it would be very interesting to try and figure out what exactly he saw. Now, after reading this, I thought that maybe there was something else that science hadn't investigated, some kind of catastrophic event that disturbed the magnetic field and atmosphere on Mars. Now, science believed that the atmosphere was destroyed 4 billion years ago when the planet cooled and plate tectonics all stopped. But now we're seeing evidence that Mars is still an active planet, so that leads us to the question, when did Mars lose its atmosphere? Now going back to this. The search party went inside a larger boat with rounded walls and shiny metal. Now you guys are experts. I don't have to tell you what that is. That's a spacecraft. Okay, so they found a crazy place with volcanoes and gas pockets and really strange plants. It was a volatile place, but it had vegetation. So it's definitely got some of those key factors we were looking at. Now, it's likely that what he's talking about here is Earth, but we'll see. The people that he saw were over 10 feet tall. They were fighting to stay alive inside the hibernation chambers. A handful of them had volunteered to stay behind to put aside information for those who would come later. They must be very intelligent. They're doing such heroic things here, just sacrificing themselves for the greater knowledge. Oh. Okay, so they were giants, and they came to Earth, and they built the pyramids. Does that sound about right? Yeah. So another thing that he mentioned when he did this remote viewing was that the solar system once had different orbits and positions. Now that's something that they don't talk about in science. They just think it was all formed 4.6 billion years ago, the whole thing just all in a whack. There's no change. So yeah, it's interesting, these different perspectives. Right, so I want to talk about that last point, because scientists presume that the solar system formed exactly 4.6 billion years ago. I don't actually believe that's correct. I've read quite a few stories to the contrary. I want you to look at the similarities between Mars and Earth. The day length is almost identical. Now, if we look at the length of the Mars day, it's 24 hours and 37 minutes. And one Earth day is 24 hours. Do you think that's a coincidence? Well, if the Earth did not have a moon, it would spin much faster. Instead of a 24-hour day, it would be a 5-hour day. So the Earth would spin a lot faster, and you know, in fact, it would not be habitable. You couldn't, yeah, there would be no life on Earth if we didn't have the moon. Now, this is pretty heavy stuff. I'll try and explain it to the best I can. Okay, so this is all about planetary rotation. I'm going to explain why Earth would not be habitable if it was rotating faster. If you want to keep a good cloud cover over the planet with only mild temperature fluctuations, it needs to be spinning slowly enough that these Hadley cells can form. Now these Hadley cells, they need to cover the entire planet, and it helps to circulate the air from, so this is, say this is the sunny side, so this is facing the sun, so this is the warm side and this is the dark side, or the cold side. And if you want to circulate the air all the way around so this dark side doesn't freeze, then you need to have these Hadley cells. Now, if the planet has a thick atmosphere and the Hadley cells are working well, and a normal rotation, it could be shielded from the sun's radiation, even if it came quite close to the sun while it was orbiting around. Now, imagine that you wanted to colonize Earth, but it was spinning too quickly and it was too hot. You could slow it down using the moon. Now, I just want to put it out there. I'm not going to talk about it much tonight, but it is possible that the survivors of Mars created the moon to make Earth more habitable, to slow it down, create some gravitational pull. Zecharia Sitchin was a self-taught scholar who was one of the only few people who had learned how to translate ancient Sumerian clay tablets. His translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh was made into a book called The 12th Planet. Here. So this book was a bestseller, sold millions of copies worldwide, and the tablets, they described a place called Nibiru. It was a planet, and it had a very elliptical orbit. So this red line here, this is Nibiru's orbit, and here's our solar system with the sun in the middle and all the planets going around, and Nibiru's got this gigantic orbit, 3,600 years. So you've probably heard this story before, but okay, so you're probably wondering, what is this amazing story got to do with Mars? But bear with me, I'm going to get to that. We're going to listen to a bit of a story. This is just paraphrased from Sitchin's book. The story confirmed that Nibiru orbits the sun in a very elongated path, spending a great deal of time far outside the commonly accepted barriers of the solar system, the boundaries. So when it is near the sun, Nibiru becomes very hot. But when it is in deep space, it becomes very cold. Enki describes Nibiru as a nascent world with a very thick atmosphere. So that's really important, needs protection. It is fueled and renewed by a constant stream of volcanic eruptions. So it has active plate tectonics. We know that's crucial as well. This thick vapor canopy helps protect the planet from heat, helps it retain heat when it is far from the sun, and deflects away harmful cosmic rays and excessive heat when it passes through the inner solar system. In this way, the atmosphere protects the planet and moderates the climate and gives rise to lakes, streams, and lush vegetation. It allows all manner of life in the waters and on the land to sprout. So this is all Nibiru. Amazing planet. It's much larger than Earth, by the way. Now, by the rule of the 5th king of Nibiru, things began to deteriorate. The fields diminished in their yields, fruits and grains lost abundance. From circuit to circuit nearing the sun, heat grew stronger. In the faraway abode, the coolness was much more biting. So, what's happening there? Those Hadley cells I was talking about, if they didn't have that thick atmosphere, the planet would have been completely uninhabitable. So, it's falling apart. The savants studied the problem and discovered that the volcanoes were no longer belching. So we weren't getting all these gases going up into the atmosphere. The atmosphere was thinning because of it. As Nibiru's atmosphere continued to deteriorate, attempts were made to reinforce it. But some felt a better strategy might be to somehow force the volcanoes to increase their belching. How's that going to work? That's a pretty crazy scheme. Okay, the first solution that they tried to use was weapons of terror or nuclear bombs to blast the volcanoes and awaken their belching to rebuild the atmosphere. The other solution was to obtain large quantities of a rare metal, gold, and suspend it in the atmosphere to rebuild the shield. And there was very little gold on Nibiru or on the outer planets, but it existed in great quantities in the hammered bracelet, which was also called the asteroid belt. Now, amidst political turmoil, a leader named Alalu took some weapons of terror, the nuclear bombs, and used them to blast a safe passage through the hammered bracelet. He was a bit of a rebel. The others didn't approve of this blasting. Now, crash landing on Earth, Alalu discovered that the planet was rich in gold. They all rejoiced. A second leader named Enki came as well, and he led another expedition, and he wanted to take all the gold from Earth back to Nibiru to try and rebuild the atmosphere. So all this happened about 450,000 years ago, so a long time before humans were on Earth. Now, might recognise this. So after some land ownership disagreements, Alalu was exiled to Mars. Now, plans were made for way stations to be built on both the Moon and Mars to help with the transportation of gold. Now, there was a skilled pilot named Anzu who accompanied Alalu, but Alalu died not long after, and his pal Anzu buried him in a cave. Enki's half-sister, he was the second expedition leader, his half-sister, a skilled doctor named Ninmah, commanded that a proper monument to Alalu be fashioned out of the mountain under which he was buried. To quote, I'm going to quote this, "The image of Alalu upon the great mountain with beams they carved." So what they're saying is they carved him using kind of laser weapons. They showed him wearing an eagle's helmet. His face they left uncovered. Let the image of Alalu gaze forever towards Nibiru that he ruled, towards the earth whose gold he discovered. It is believed that the monument that the tablets refer to is the face on Mars. So this is a picture from 1976, and this caused a big outcry. People thought, wow, there's a face on Mars. Now, I don't think these stories just were made up. They had to have come from somewhere. We'll talk about the face on Mars. So the original photo that I was just pointing out was taken in 1976. Now, when NASA returned in 1998 to Mars, they took more pictures because they wanted to to squash these claims. They wanted to say, no, that's just a trick of the light. Yeah, and what they say, the actual phenomena, they call it is pareidolia. It means the brain's attempt to attribute meaning to random stimuli. It's just a fancy way of saying you're just seeing things. There's nothing. And yet here we have a reference in these 20,000-year-old tablets which describe this exact feature. Now at the top here we've got an artist impression of what it would have looked like originally before, you know, things started to get all eroded away. And this is the picture that NASA took when they went back to Mars the second time. So what they did was they took it at a particular angle to make sure that none of these shadows, you couldn't see the shadows, and it just looked like some kind of blob. But the thing is that you can see features in this one that you can't see in this one. There's actually 2 eyes and there's some nose holes. Yeah, so in a way they were actually giving away more information than they realised. Now this is some comments from this guy, tectonics, has also passed away. Yeah, it's very sad, these people. Okay, so taken at a more revealing sun angle than its predecessor, Viking frame 70A13 not only confirmed the salient facial resemblance but showed the continuation of a mouth feature and a second eye. And NASA chooses to ignore that there is a controversy. The face doesn't fall into academically palatable models of how extraterrestrial intelligence will reveal itself. So this is not the right way. They're saying you will communicate the way I want you to, and they're saying that the best way for ETs to communicate with us is radio signals. So if the Anunnaki were on Mars and they created the face, do you think they might have left us a few other clues? Indeed they did. For surrounding the face is what some people believe to be an entire complex of ancient ruins. So there's a 5-sided pyramid. It's just flicking there. The reason I've got it flicking is just so you can see how symmetrical it is. Yeah, it's pretty perfect. I call that bilateral symmetry. And nature does not form shapes of this large size in such symmetry. It doesn't look natural. Still, the scientists, they tried to come up with some awesome mundane explanations. I've listed them up there because they're quite amusing. Okay, they've got a wind-eroded landform. So they're saying it's just been kind of blown out like that. That's just wind erosion. They're saying it's mass wasting. They're saying it's a volcano. Do you know any volcanoes that have steep, sharp, well-defined sides like that? I mean, you saw the volcanoes on Mars. They're all very shallow and they don't look like that. They want steep. Oh, this last one was extremely good. An extremely large underground crystal. Right. And this is what it looks like. It's so artificial looking, isn't it? Yeah, and this was just very close to the face. So this is probably where the Anunnaki, this is where they were hanging out when they were living on Mars. Okay. So now we're going to step back even further in time. So the Anunnaki about 450,000 years ago, but we're going to go back even further. Experiencer Alec Newald recounts a story of a much older civilization that once inhabited Mars. In his book, Alec Newald talks about a planet named Kuiper that was located in the solar system where the asteroid belt is today. So Kuiper orbited in a slightly elliptical manner outside the orbit of Mars. It was a predominantly water planet, smaller but not unlike Earth. The water was mostly frozen, as Kuiper was much farther from the sun than our Earth. When it was closest to the sun, Kuiper was quite conducive to life. When it was not, the life forms that had been seeded on the planet would simply go underground. So we know why they go underground, because it's warmer. What a surprise. So some of the life forms hibernated when it was too cold, while others used the planet's natural resources such as thermal heat to keep themselves warm. They constructed huge underground bases with all the comforts of home, and some of the life forms chose to remain underground permanently. Two distinct races formed. This is all from Alec Neward's history lesson. He said there was a surface race who preferred the simple life in harmony with nature. So they were able to withstand the cold. They were extremely psychic and they developed a hairy outer cover to protect themselves. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, so this is what I think you're talking about. This guy, who's this? This is Sasquatch. Yeah. Yeah, the other word is a Bigfoot. Okay, so I think it is more than likely that the Sasquatch on Earth are the descendants of these beings. So these are from Kuiper, which is the asteroid belt that's been destroyed. Right. A planet that was the asteroid belt, yeah. Okay, so the second race. The second race was also intelligent, but they were technologically advanced. They became smaller in stature and more delicate than the surface dwellers. After eons of time, they needed no body hair at all. They just evolved away from that. Now, if these beings evolved on Kuiper over millions of years, they would look very different. The hairy beings would have had to endure the harsh cold but lived a simple life. The underground beings relied on technology, and thus their bodies became small and withered and they didn't have any body hair. Strangely enough, there have been a number of connections between the Sasquatch and UFOs. For example, this was an article that appeared in the World Weekly News, 1981. It's called the Oscar Zamora sighting. He reported that he saw a Bigfoot-like creature next to a cigar-shaped metal object. As they watched, a metal ladder descended from the craft and the man climbed inside. It rose slowly with white, glaring lights until it was about 20 feet in the air, and then, a few seconds later, sped off at incredibly high speed. So, I think we know what that is. Now, another sighting was reported by Linda Moulton Howe in her book, Glimpses of Other Realities. In 1983, two witnesses, their names were Ron and Paula Watson, watched through binoculars as two small humanoids, these little guys here. Now what they're doing is they're carrying a paralysed cow. Yeah, so that's got to get your mind ticking, you know, with all these cattle mutilations going on. So if you want to know who's been doing them, to the one side of the craft is what they said was a lizard man, and on the other side was a Bigfoot. This was just a sighting. So clearly these visiting ETs do not always look like your typical grey. If we want to understand the phenomena, we need to accept that some creatures are going to have animal-like features. They can be highly intelligent and they can be working together even though they look totally different. So we're just going to go back now to Alec's story about the history of Mars. Now, the subterranean race, that was the little grey looking guys, they discovered space travel. Eventually they attempted to travel interdimensionally. However, something went terribly wrong, very wrong, and their planet Kuiper was destroyed. They blew it up. The subterranean race attempted to save as many life forms as they could, and on their spaceship they took with them a group of the hairy surface dwellers and some of the others that lived deep within Kuiper's icy cold waters. Upon arrival at one of Kuiper's moon stations, and this is where it starts to get pretty out there, guys, they converted it into a spacecraft. They went to a moon and made it into a spacecraft. Okay. I try to get my head around that. Okay. They used this unusual vehicle to travel the relatively short distance to their nearest neighbour, which was Mars. Wow. You're just not going to make this stuff up, surely, not in that kind of detail. What is really interesting is that science is actually starting to collaborate some of this information. Only a few weeks ago, on July 17th, NASA released some pictures of this bizarre bright spots on the planet Ceres. So this thing here, this here. Now, you're probably wondering, how is this related? Well, Ceres is the largest planet, it's the largest object in the asteroid belt. It's a dwarf planet, and it's about 1/4 the size of the moon, so it's pretty small. But if Kuiper did explode to make the asteroid belt, Ceres is the largest evidence of what could have once been a habitable planet that got blown up. And this thing here, these white spots that NASA found at the base of some of the impact craters, they are salt deposits. And where do we find salt? In the oceans. So they think that this planet Ceres, which is a fragment of a larger planet, once had oceans. So that's a fairly strong collaborative evidence with Alec Newald's story. So this is what else he had to say. At this time, Mars had atmosphere and water, but the destruction of Kuiper and the subsequent after effects were to spell the end of the Martian atmosphere. So if you can just imagine, here you are, you're a planet, you're sitting here, and right next to you there's this big explosion. You can imagine that this planet that's sitting here is going to be affected by another one being blown up nearby. Whew. So both humanoid groups live side by side on the Martian planet, and the aquatic types live within the Martian seas. So that's when they went to Mars. However, they knew that they would eventually have to find a more permanent home. So the hairy and the aquatic types went to Earth, while the subterranean beings set up bases on the moon. Maybe it'll come back. There it goes. I must have bumped something. A small group of the beings chose to remain on Mars but were forced to live underground. And this group of small beings is still living on Mars today, underground. So that's where science isn't looking, because they don't want to go there because they might actually find something. Yeah. So here we have a very interesting alternative explanation as to how Mars lost its atmosphere. And it wasn't just because the planet cooled and plate tectonics stopped happening. That's probably still going on. An exploding planet, what is now the asteroid belt, could be the reason why we're seeing that Martian dichotomy. If you remember seeing that the top half was blue and the bottom half was all... Could that be related to the big explosion? The story also correlates well with the remote viewing, where we heard from John I'm trying to say that name.
Joe McMonagle.
McMonagle, there we go. That's a mouth twister. Okay. With the remote viewing, which describes planets on a dying planet with a search party looking for somewhere else to live. So it all ties in. Now, is there any scientific evidence to suggest that we might have originally come from Mars? I mean, that sounds pretty way out, doesn't it? Does it? Yeah, so the idea that life could have started on Mars before coming to Earth is actually becoming a lot more accepted by the scientific community. It's possible that our link to Mars is much stronger than we have been led to believe. Not only that, there is some evidence to suggest that we have been visiting Mars a lot longer than NASA would have us believe. Is there a NASA cover-up? Oh. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this guy. This is Robert Newbrin. Oops, wrong button. This one. This guy, Robert Newbrin, and his pal Martin Marietta put forward a proposal that would put humans on Mars within 10 years. It was designed to be as simple and cost-effective as possible. they would send an unmanned rocket full of supplies 2 years ahead of any people, and it would land on the planet and start making fuel. So they would do this by converting the carbon dioxide atmosphere into methane. And this fuel that was made 2 years before the people arrived, they would use that fuel to get them back home, back to Earth. That seemed like a really good scheme, and he put it forward. And for 30 years, NASA said, no way, can't do it, too many flaws. Now, this guy, Robert Newbern, was so frustrated, he made a documentary about it, and he called it The Mars Underground. And he describes his struggle to bring the dream to reality. And this documentary actually formed the basis for a Hollywood movie that many of you have probably seen. It's called The Martian. And it's about an astronaut that is trapped on Mars. Now, one of the reasons that NASA put forward to reject all his schemes was back contamination. What's back contamination? This is the excuse they're saying that why they can't do this mission, because Mars, which apparently has no life, is going to contaminate the Earth. You can see the hypocrisy coming out, can't you?
Never a straight answer.
Yeah, exactly. Does NASA know something about life on Mars, but is not telling us? If we went to the moon in 1969, is it possible that we already have been to Mars and they just want us to think that we haven't? So we could have been there for many years. If we've had the knowledge and the capability of going there, yeah, it's quite possible, but they don't want us to know about it. Now, if you keep something secret for a really long time, eventually bits and pieces start to leak out. Now, you probably recognise this. This is from Corey Good's stories. Now, I'm not a huge fan, but some of the things he's been saying are starting to make sense when you look at everything in the big picture. Now, Corey Good described how he was physically immobilised for 2 weeks while a variety of pharmaceutical products were used on him. And at the end of the 2 weeks, Good described waking up feeling groggy, but now being 20 years younger. That's not actually him, but it's a representation of what this age regression looks like. Significantly, when he awoke, his physical environment was completely different. He had been time travelled back to when he first began his space program service. He described his memories being wiped and screen memories being put in place. And he was then transported back to only a few minutes after he was first taken in 1986, just before his 17th birthday. Now, Good says he was among a small group of people that they tried to use this memory wiping technology on, but it just didn't work. I mean, they tried it again and again, and he just still remembered what happened. And there are 2 other people that have a similar story, and their names are Michael Ralph and Randy Kramer. The stories that we've heard over the last hour or so, we've realised just how habitable Mars really is. And we've had the technology to go there for quite a long time. So what is the full picture when we put it all together? So in a nutshell, Mars has had life for billions of years. There are probably human beings and ETs living on Mars right now. And just to finish off, this is a summary of all that I've just talked about, all the different bits and pieces. Okay, as Susie Hansen said last month, collaboration is very important. When we compare these strange stories with scientific knowledge, they suddenly start to make sense. Yeah, I see a few nods out there, that's good. We know why planets become uninhabitable. We know that there are basic ingredients that life needs. If a planet cannot sustain life, then a species must move along and colonise another planet. You generally cannot fix it. I mean, Nibiru, what was happening there, they couldn't reverse it. They tried. You've got to move somewhere else, or you just die. Anyway, you can see where I've just drawn little lines, so that the different colours are where I think things are connected. If you just want to read that for a second. I'll leave that up there, but I just want to leave you with one thought, and that is that there is life on Mars, and we are definitely not alone in the universe. Thanks, everyone.